Good afternoon. Thanks for staying on for this. It's a real honor to be invited to give this keynote talk, and there are some special reasons for that. BERA is an important organization for me because a conference of BERA in New York in the 90s was my first face-to-face encounter with British educational research. And I think that led to my first job application in the UK, which actually took place on this very campus. I didn't get a job. They appointed someone much better than me, so that's good for Sussex. And I also have to say that the UK has become a very important country for me. So I hope they will let EU citizens continue for a while in the future, particularly its higher education culture. I come from the Netherlands, and what I really appreciate, and I keep reminding colleagues in the UK about that, is that UK higher education still has real intellectual freedom. There is no money, there is a lot of bureaucracy, there is a lot to complain about, but intellectually you can do what you find important. And I have worked in systems that have created academic monocultures that are very good at doing that only thing, but in which there is no space for the diversity of the work I've been able to do in the UK. So we shouldn't forget that, and for me that's an important reason why I really like it here. I've prepared quite a lot for this talk. I always do a bit too much, so you have to be selective and look out for what speaks to you. I guess there will be enough words that each of you can take one word from what's on the PowerPoint, and that will be your word. And when I was thinking about this presentation, I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could start it with an anecdote and say something like, on the 12th of October 2014, I decided to stop learning, and life has been great ever since. Well, I've done it now, and it's part of what I'm going to try to talk about under the title, Interrupting the Politics of Learning, and in the background there's something about reclaiming the beautiful risk of education. I want to locate the talk with three figures and three quotes. One, birds and beasts have intelligence but no sense of duty. Maybe the meaning of that will become clear a little later. The man in the middle with the cat is Jacques Derrida, who opens his book Spectres of Marx by saying, to live, by definition, is not something one learns. I really like that. He actually says, but that's another discussion, what we really need to learn is how to die. And then there is Carl Rogers, who in the 60s wrote a really important book intellectually, but also politically, the book Freedom to Learn. And in that book, he argues for learning as a right, as a human right, and there he is particularly responding to the idea of teaching as an act of control. So Rogers really puts learning at the emancipatory end of the spectrum. And I would say in the 1960s, that made a lot of sense. And the question I want to explore is whether that still makes sense today, or whether we are somewhere else and should be aware of that. And maybe you are all already aware of what I'm going to try to say, but maybe there's a little bit that helps. So when we talk about today, I would characterize our age very much as a learning age. And this phrase, learning age, is already quite old. There is quite a lot of history from the 90s. But some in the room may remember a publication written, The Learning Age, and the subtitle you probably can't read. Does anyone still remember it? A Renaissance for a New Britain. So there was quite a promise that the learning age would change everything. This discourse about the importance of learning has been going on. Here is a quote from a UNESCO report from 2011, and it gives a an argument about learning which I see being repeated almost on the first page of every document on education you open. That we're living in a fast-changing and complex socio-economic and political world, to which we need to adapt by increasingly rapidly acquiring new knowledge, skills, and attitudes in a wide range of contexts. This probably sounds familiar. And then it says an individual will not be able to meet life challenges unless he or she becomes a lifelong learner, and the society will not be sustainable unless it becomes a learning society. And this is what I have noticed, that learning is nowadays omnipresent in all kinds of different ways. What often comes with that is the suggestion that learning is sort of automatically something that is good and desirable. But what you also see, for example, in the UNESCO quote, is that learning is something inevitable. And there are claims, here's a quote from the book John Field wrote on lifelong learning and the new educational order. Well, he says learning is seen as an unavoidable biological fact. We learn as we breathe all the time without giving it any thought. So learning here becomes something we have to do, but also, worryingly I would say, but that's the point I'm going to make, something we apparently cannot not do, and therefore it's something we have to continue to do. And there is one argument for lifelong learning. What comes out of that way of thinking is also the idea that therefore learning can be and should be measured and monitored. And I don't know whether you've ever come across the European lifelong learning indicators, but this is a whole system to try to figure out how in all European countries learning is happening and where they are. And you end up with a whole ranking. Again, you probably can't see the detail. But of course, you want to know where your own country is and whether you are learning enough. So the question I have is this really so? Is learning something we have to do throughout our lives, something we cannot not do, that we need to continue doing? Questions I want to explore is, what if learning, rather than just being positive and good, is also part of some of the problems we encounter in education or society at large? What if learning may be getting in the way of life? It's another question I will raise. Could there therefore be reasons to go beyond learning, to say there is more than learning and there ought to be more? And might that be important for the work we do as educators in education? And here I use this phrase, the beautiful risk. So there is a brief commercial break now. I'll partly make use of the book Dom already mentioned, Beautiful Risk of Education. The book discusses some of these topics. I just published another book, The Rediscovery of Teaching, in which I continue to explore, and I will point to some of those books. And I'll start with two other books, and I was saying to Dom, if I speak for an hour and there is no time for people to ask questions, at least if they listen carefully, they don't have to read the 4 books. So that's the deal. In some earlier work, particularly these 2 books, Beyond Learning and Good Education and Age of Measurement, I made a number of observations that focused particularly on the rise of the language of learning in education, which I still find a remarkable development, and I keep seeing evidence of it. And I coined a word there to refer to this development where learning has become the central word, calling it the learnification of education. I'll explain a bit more what I mean by that. That there is a change in language is something I think you can see in a number of different ways. So instead of talking about students or pupils or children or adults, you see again and again this word learner emerging. Teaching is often redescribed as facilitating learning. And one I really don't understand, but I think I also don't want to understand, delivering learning experiences. I find that a very strange way to describe teaching. Teachers are called facilitators of learning. Schools are called learning environments, places for learning. And I would also say this complicated, highly political field with a rich history of adult education has been rebranded as lifelong learning. And I think it's partly a brand name, and I think things have happened there as well. Now, this change in language doesn't come from one particular cause. I think there are a range of overlapping and interacting developments. One that I think is really important, and that's where you can go back to Carl Rogers, is that it comes out of a critique of authoritarian forms of education that only look at teachers, at curricula, and getting that into students. And then you can say the language of learners and learning is liberating because it brings the other end of the spectrum into view. I also think that constructivist theories of learning and wider constructivist theories of knowledge has contributed to this development, and I'll come back to that a little later. There are also more political trends, particularly visible in the field of lifelong learning, where you can say if you believe in adult education, then it requires that as a society you make provision so that adults can get education. When you begin to talk about lifelong learning, you begin to shift the responsibility for that work to individuals, and that's a particular trick of neoliberal policies. And then there are the learning sciences that are also emerging, and some people say that is the future of educational research. Partly they may be a cause of this development, but they could also be a symptom of how the centrality of learning is also changing the whole research enterprise. Now, what may be the problem with the language of learning? And for me, it's first of all a problem at the level of language, but I think the ways we speak and talk and write does impact on how we think and what we do. This is a very quick way to indicate the problem I see with the language of learning, where I would say the point of education is not that children or pupils or students learn. And I pause here because I find it remarkable how again and again in policy documents, but also I think in research papers, this is roughly what's being said. The task of schools is to make students learn, or the task of the lifelong learning infrastructure is to make adults learn. I would say in education, when we bring together people, time, financial resources, there is something more specific at stake. The question for education is always, you can say, but I'll start pushing that a bit more a little later, that students learn something, that they learn it for a reason, and that they learn it from someone. And I find it remarkable when you look at how languages work, that the language of learning, particularly in English, is very much a process language, an individual language, and you could say an individualizing language. Whereas education, I would say, always raises questions of content, what's the learning about, purpose, what's the learning for, and relationships. Another way to make the point, to say the word learning is just not precise enough, is that learning can mean many things. So if you look at just a couple of examples, learning that 2 and 2 equals 4, learning the second law of thermodynamics, learning to ride a bike, learning to be patient, learning that you are not good at something, all of this is learning. So if we just say our job is to make people learn, we are not describing our job well. And for me, that is a problem with the language of learning. So there is always the question in educational discussions of the what of learning, what is it about, and what is it for? And I think this discussion about what is the purpose or what are the purposes of education is a really important discussion to have. Also to begin to see that there is no one purpose to education, but that schools and other educational institutions have to juggle a number of different agendas. And I would say their education, but also educational research, becomes interesting. I've suggested a distinction for school education between a role in qualification and socialization and in what I call subjectification, the formation of the subject. There's work around adult education that talks about the economic, personal, and democratic dimension of education. These are all discussions that say if we just say it's learning, we're missing the question what it's for. So you could say learning means too many things, and therefore just to have that word there doesn't mean enough. That's why I think it's unhelpful as an educational language, and one of the ambitions in my work is to try to keep developing languages in which we can be more precise in our work as educators. So that's one concern about learning, which you may share or not. But all these discussions do not happen in some kind of abstract intellectual vacuum. They happen in real life, and in real life I think the language of learning and the idea of learning has also been colonized, to use a Habermasian term. One history in which you can see that really well is in the domain of adult education. I have a couple of important and influential books and documents here, and you can slowly sort of trace there a change in language, but also a change in discourse. Lindemann, 1925, talks about the meaning of adult education. Yaxley talks about lifelong education. The Fauré report, Learning to Be, which connects learning very much to the big global democratic issues. OECD in 73, recurrent education, I would say that's still pretty good. UNESCO, learning the treasure within. But then things begin to shift in the 90s. And when you look at lifelong learning for all, which rhetorically is a fantastic title, who could be against lifelong learning for all? Well, me maybe. You begin to see that a different rationale becomes center stage. The need to improve the capacity of individuals, families, workplaces, and communities to continuously adapt and renew. That becomes the rationale for lifelong learning, where the question what to adapt to maybe is a question that doesn't get enough attention. Learning as an important factor in promoting employment and economic development, and when you read the document, it's always economic development first, and then I think they try to be politically correct by saying, okay, we also need to mention democracy and social cohesion, but it's always in the background of something that is more important. And that's also what you see in what I mentioned earlier, the European lifelong learning indicators. This is not about people leading complicated, meaningful, beautiful lives, but it's lifelong learning as a key strategy to adjust human capital to new requirements. So the learning sort of disappears from our own control. And there you can begin to see that the emancipatory power of learning maybe comes under pressure as well. One way to characterize the shift is to say if learning started out to be a right to fight for, under the later regimes, learning becomes a duty, and that's what we're hearing again and again. It's our duty to remain lifelong learners. So there is something happening in the way in which learning is being sort of co-opted into bigger political discussions, and I think that should worry us. But there is also something happening in, I think, the way we talk about learning and what that does. And I want to look briefly at that. There is a nice story behind this, because a couple of years ago I gave a course in Canada to doctoral students, and we were talking about these things, and sort of the end of the first week, one of the students came up to me and she said, would you like to come over to us for dinner? And I thought, well, that's really kind, an invitation. So I said yes. And then she says, because my husband is a learning scientist, and each time when I go home after your classes and talk enthusiastically about this critique of learning, he just doesn't get it, and we end up in big arguments. So would you like to come over for dinner? So I thought, okay, there is more at stake here than just a nice meal. Of course, he was a very nice guy, and we had a good conversation. And he said, yes, I'm a learning scientist, and what we do in the learning sciences is we study intelligent adaptive systems. And then he said, isn't that what education is all about? And that phrase, intelligent adaptive systems, actually stayed with me, because I do see that a lot of understanding of learning, but also of educational dynamics when they are understood and enacted through the language of learning, go back to this idea of intelligent adaptive systems. So I think there is also an imaginary of learning that I want to look at. And although there are wonderful things to say about intelligent adaptive systems, the question that stayed with me is that language and that imaginary, is that an adequate way to understand what it means to be a student in an educational relationship? And I have a bit of a philosophical background, so for me there's also a bigger question. Is that how we actually want to understand ourselves as human beings? So after the weeks in Canada, I traveled back home, and then a lot of mail sort of piles up in your post box. And so I took it all and I put it on the table, and there were flyers from shops around. And suddenly my eye was caught by what I think was the perfect image of an intelligent adaptive system, namely a robot vacuum cleaner. At the time I was living in Luxembourg, and it was in French. And what also caught my eye is that in French they are called robot aspirateur autonome. So as an educator I saw this word autonomy and I thought, oh, there is a lot here. But when I start thinking about it, I think actually this robot vacuum cleaner fits very well in an understanding of learning that I think is quite influential in education, that focuses on individuals and their ability to adapt intelligently to changing environments. And that's how these machines work. So you put them in a room and they start to hover the room, and then they bump into a chair or in a plant, and there's a very nice clip on YouTube actually where there is a dog sleeping and the thing sort of bumps into the dog. But the next time it goes through the room, it does it more effectively and more efficiently. So you can say this system is intelligent, it can adapt intelligently, you can say it has learned. And here you can see what this idea of designing learning environments in which students then develop their intelligence or their adaptability. For me, this image shows very nicely what is going on there. So the argument that the task of education is to design learning environments so that learners can become more effective at adaptation to differing conditions has actually become an educational rationale and a curriculum rationale. When you look at the literature on 21st century skills, that's mainly what I read into it, that through a process like this we acquire the skills to operate in this future that apparently we do not know what it will be like. The question I have here is that learning is very much depicted as adaptation to environmental conditions, and that you can say in a broader sense is a notion of human life as survival and becoming equipped to survive. And for me, again, the bigger question is human life, when it's lived humanely, is that about our individual survival, or is there more at stake? So I've also become concerned about the bigger idea of survival that is behind this learning logic that has become an educational logic. And then I think there is one thing that is missing in this imaginary, because the machine, the intelligent adaptive machine, is very good at adapting at new environment conditions. But the only thing that this machine cannot do is ask the question, is this an environment I should be adapting to? So the machine is completely dependent on its environment. And for me, that shows another thing that's missing in this imaginary. Where does this question, this judgment that needs to be made, whether the environment we're put in is the environment we should be adapting to, which is the survival question. I could say that's the life question. That question is missing in the picture. So I would say this imaginary that I think is influential and comes out a particular way of understanding learning raises some bigger educational and existential issues. Looking at some of the things that are happening with learning, the language of learning and the logic of learning, begins to reveal, hopefully, that learning is not this innocent and happy thing that we're often told it is. And that's what I try to express with this notion of the politics of learning, where I'm interested in the political things that are happening through learning and through the language of learning. And I want to mention three things that I think we should be aware of. One thing, and I've already alluded to that in the shift from adult education to lifelong learning, is that you can see there that political and collective issues are turned into learning problems. And by turning them into learning problems and sort of putting them on the desk or the plate of individual learners, the bigger political and collective dimensions begin to disappear. As a learning problem, before you know it, it's a problem you have to sort out without asking the question, where did the problem come from, who is benefiting from this particular problem construction, and why do I have to sort all the problems created by global capitalism, to say it too quickly. So there we see this duty to learn, for example, emerging. And that duty to learn is linked to a number of domains. It's strongly linked to employability. You also see it getting into the whole domain of citizenship and social integration. All these domains begin to rephrase the issues as learning problems for individuals. That, for me, is one area where we can see the politics of learning. But it's not only happening outside of ourselves. There is important work coming, sort of inspired by Foucault, to say we are also doing this to ourselves. Governmentality as the idea of turning ourselves into permanent learning subjects, as colleagues from Belgium, Jan Maschalijn and Martin Simons, call it. So they ask this question, where does actually our will to learn and our desire to learn, where does that come from? How is that constructed? Is that simply natural and innocent, or is this politics? Has it also ended up inside our desire to learn? So when, I forgot the name of the author, the UNESCO report, The Treasure Within, I think you can say learning has shifted from a treasure within to a pressure within. And it's this strange pressure we also feel inside ourselves. And for me, this also has to do with the naturalization of learning. To claim that something is natural, you could say, is maybe the biggest political claim to make. And I see this again in the domain of lifelong learning, where there is sort of a slippery slope, where you start with any normal human being can learn. Then before you know it, the can becomes a should. Any normal human being should learn. And then if you not want to learn, you are not normal. I think about 15 years ago in English policy, this idea of hard-to-reach learners emerged. And I partly understand where it comes from, and partly I don't want to understand it. It is this idea that are somewhere sort of in the dark corners of society, late at night, the people who do not want to learn are hiding. And then I'm beginning to think, so we must then invent a learning police who goes for them and say, you're not learning and you should be learning. So there you see this innocent idea that, yeah, learning is natural, we do it all the time, can turn into something political that is quite problematic. So if this makes sense, you can begin to ask, well, what do we do? Is it possible to push back a little? And I'm trying to make the case that that's important to do, but then there is the question of strategy. And an important shift there is to never accept that learning is just this simple, natural thing, but always try to bring it back to its political and societal and historical configurations and constructions. That means that it's important to highlight the artificial character of learning. And there's nice work, and the Stables has done some of that work. If we start, say, from a very sort of broad definition of learning as any more or less durable change in something, in cognition, in behavior, in attitude, that's not a result of maturation, then learning becomes almost equal to change. But when you then begin to ask, what is the word learning doing there? You can say we call some change learning when we like it or when we don't like it. That would be an argument for saying learning is actually not a descriptive term, but it's an evaluative term. And it's a really interesting way to look at your own use of the word learning and look for the judgment that actually comes with it, to say, oh, someone is learning there. That means that there is change that you value or think is negative. As I said, Andy Stables has done work on that, where he says, well, that actually means that learning is also not a noun, it doesn't describe, but it's a judgment we always make after the event. So none of us knows whether we are learning at this very moment, but maybe tonight or tomorrow or 20 years from now, we look back and then we make a judgment and say that has changed something. This is one way to begin to show that learning is not just a description of something that happens irrespective of what we do. But you can go a bit further in this interruption and resistance of the politics of learning by considering, are there situations where we should actually refuse the demand to learn? And I was sort of joking by saying that the duty for us to learn throughout our lives is partly to solve the problems created by global capitalism, but that's part of the analysis, that we have systems of doing economy and production that need highly flexible units so that we constantly can move production to the cheapest location. And lifelong learning is partly just to make that possible. But you can also think of settings where maybe there is nothing to learn. I have problems with saying before you can become a citizen, you need to learn a lot and you need to do an exam. I think that begins to undermine the idea that citizenship starts by being a right and that there is actually nothing to learn, nothing to demand from you in order to get that right. So the whole area of learning for citizenship and citizenship exams raises some problems there. There are other examples, but for me, this is an important one. I wrote a paper called The Ignorant Citizen in order to highlight, to say, to be a citizen, you actually do not need to know anything because it starts by understanding that citizenship is a right and that it's in a very different political dynamics. And then there is a third aspect, and I'm just giving some lines along which I've thought about what does this resistance mean, which has to do with the whole question of the identity of the learner. What does it actually mean to be a learner or to call yourself a learner? And more philosophically, you can ask the question, what I call here the ontology of learning. How does learning actually position us in the world? And is that the only or the natural or the best way to be in the world? So I'd like to raise a number of questions around this theme. What is the learning identity, the learning position? How does learning position us in the world? I've already discussed one example of that, which is the idea of learning as intelligent adaptation. But I also see another broad understanding of learning. I saw it on Twitter yesterday, where learning is seen as an act of understanding, of sense-making, meaning-giving. And again, there is a lot of educational activity that says, yeah, this is the task of the learner. It is to make sense, to come to understanding. These ideas have been around for a while. The general idea of learning as come to understanding, but also the more specific idea of learning as intelligent adaptation. You can find it in systems theory, the theory of autopoietic systems, for example. You also find it very strongly in pragmatism, and it's one of the things I've been writing about. It's also the reason why I think Dewey's work is great, but it's limited, and the limit is partly here. It also goes into the whole philosophy of hermeneutics. I mentioned Gadamer here, the idea that the human being is sort of, yeah, at its basic level, a sense-making and meaning-making being. When we think of ourselves in this mode, you could say, then we see human beings as beings who try to understand, come to understanding, try to comprehend. And there's something beautiful in the word comprehension, because you can say this is about grasping something that is outside of us, the prehension, in its totality. That's the ambition. When you then ask what is this relationship between me and the world, you can say the world is there for me as an object of my understanding, my meaning-making, my signification. So it starts from me, and then there is the world I try to make sense of. If you want an image for that, or this is the image that I see, the word prehension actually has this hension, and I don't know whether there are gardeners in the room, but the Latin word for ivy is something like hendera, which goes back to the hension. So when I see comprehension, I actually see the ivy sort of creeping up on a building and completely capturing it. And we know that if that goes too far, it even has the power to destroy the building. And that's sort of where my concern lies, that if we only think of ourselves in our relation to the world as one where we try to understand and make sense, it only goes in one direction. Lévinas calls this an ego-logical way of understanding human beings in the world, according to the logic of the ego. So the ego is a sense maker. Now this is all fine, and if you want to do that for the rest of your life, that's great. The question is this all there is? And I think if this is how we understand human beings, for me it raises a couple of questions that I find fascinating and interesting, but you may think they're trivial, but I'll try nonetheless. When we think of ourselves sort of as sense makers of a world outside, one question is whether in that setup the world can speak in its own terms, or whether it can only speak in sort of the terms of our interpretive schemes. This is the whole discussion about lenses we use, for example. And there is a limit to the lens. A slightly different way to ask this question is to say, if we think of ourselves as meaning-making beings, and pragmatism does that, for example, is it possible in that setup that we are being spoken to, that we are being addressed, and if I put an interesting word here, is it possible in such a way to think about human beings that teaching is possible, that we can be taught? And here I'm beginning to see, if you can still follow what I'm trying to do, some limitations of the idea that we are just meaning-making beings who try to make meaning of what is outside of us. That is part of what we do, but I'm interested in, is there something else that comes to us irrespective of the meaning we want to make or the lenses we want to use? Is there another way of looking at this, and might that be relevant? That is sort of the point I want to work towards, and then I have some concluding comments to bring it all together, which should be okay time-wise. But I've got the name of Heidegger here on the slide, so before you know it, we get into deep philosophy. There is a discussion in the background. I mentioned earlier constructivism as a very important sort of driver of focusing on students as learners and sense makers and meaning makers. The history of constructivism is old, but Kant is an important sort of philosophical figure in thinking about knowledge as an act of construction. And what you can then see in early 20th century philosophy, and there I put the name of Heidegger, but his other work as well, is that people are looking for the opposite and to say, no, instead of we constructing the world, there is actually a world out there, and it's our task to receive that world. That's very briefly how Heidegger talks about that. We are the carers of the world, and we have to receive what comes in. You can locate the interest in education in questions of listening there, for example. But I think that there is a difference between talking about listening and the phenomenon of what I call here being addressed, where it's not you listening, but someone speaking to you. And there I see the significance of the work of Emmanuel Levinas, who argues that there is a difference between listening to someone and being addressed by or being spoken to by someone. One way to express this difference in educational language is to ask, may there be a difference between how we learn from our teachers and how we are being taught by our teachers? And some people say learning from and being taught by is exactly the same thing. I want to explore at least that these are two very different phenomena. I can learn from people around me, but to be taught by someone is precisely something that goes in the opposite direction, that comes to me. And here I'm beginning to distinguish, you can say, the identity of being in the world as a learner, trying to understand, and a different direction. You can say being in the world as someone who wants to understand asks the question, how can I understand? The act of comprehension. But I'm interested in giving this other direction also attention, where you can say the question you start with is not how can I understand, how I can make sense, what I can learn from this, but the question, what is this asking from me? What is this trying to say to me? And if the first, you can say, starts from where we are and tries to expand and deepen and broaden our understanding, this other question is an irritating question, an interrupting question. It interrupts particularly the ways in which we are working hard at making sense, and suddenly something breaks through that. And what breaks through there, you could say, with a big word, is the world that is trying to speak to us. But this goes too quickly, and I still need to write a book on it. I find this discussion between sort of child-centered and curriculum-centered education actually unhelpful, and I like to put in another notion of world-centered education, where you say one important task for education, you can say, is to turn students back to the world in order to see if the world can speak to them. Now, this sounds very abstract, and maybe you can't understand it, but I'm also trying to argue, well, understanding is not all that there is when we encounter this. But for me, it's also very practical, because this course I was talking about that I taught in Canada, one interesting thing I did there is that I started the course by saying to the students, I don't want you to learn anything. And of course, that is as strange as saying on the 12th of October 2014, I decided to stop learning. It sort of doesn't fit. Students were also confused. I was also confused, but we had 2 weeks and thought, let's see what emerges there. And the interesting thing by saying to the students, try to bracket your urge to make sense, to come to comprehension, and see what happens there. That actually opened up what I later, in my latest book, also conceptualize as opening up different existential possibilities, very different way of being in the world from being there as a learner and a sense maker. And what these students started to give back to me after the 2 weeks is that things had begun to speak to them, to address them in ways they hadn't imagined that would be possible. And for me, this shows that there is also something interesting educationally at a very practical level when we try to keep learning and sense-making and understanding out of the classroom, because I think it opens up different ways of being in the world. And these are all existential possibilities that explore this different direction of a world, and I use world in a broad sense, natural world, social world, may speak to us. And if you really want to get into discussions behind it, I'm arguing here this is very different from, say, the philosophy of care, or the idea of empathy, or recognition, or listening, which all still come from my good intentions to care for the other, or to be empathic, or to recognize, or to listen. That's all fine, but we should also be mindful that in the meantime there is stuff coming in our direction, and maybe that's trying to say something to us as well. Now, it's partly very philosophical. I've hinted at the fact that actually when you begin to give this a place in your own classroom, very different, but I think important things happen. And if you want to read more about that, you have to buy at least one of the books, but not the other ones. But there is the bigger question, why as educators would we be interested in that? Why might it be important to give our students more than just good sense-making, good intelligent adaptation, good meaning-making, and so on? For me, this has something to do, which you can theorize, or this is one set of concepts I use here, the ego-logical and the non-ego-logical way of being in the world. And this is sort of a bigger frame where you say one way in which we can be in the world is running on the logic of the ego, where it starts with our desires, our desire for understanding, for example. The non-ego-logical way, in a sense, tries to hint at the fact that the world around us is doing things with us, with our desires, our desire for sense-making, but many other desires as well. It, in a sense, interrupts the ego logic. And that question that comes to us, you can say, is a question about our desires in the broadest sense. It is the question, is what I desire, what I find in myself as a desire, is that actually what I should be desiring? Is that desirable? And I think that that is an important educational question for our own lives, but it's also a really important question for the lives we live together. Is what I desire, is that desirable for the society we want to keep into place, and I think the question of democracy is located there. And of course, many of our desires are projected on a planet that already for decades has been trying to tell us that it cannot give us everything that we want from us. So there also the question of is what I desire desirable speaks to bigger environmental problems. Now there is a tradition in education, and I would call it bad Catholic pedagogy without trying to offend the Catholics in the room, that says desire is the cause of all evil. So if we get rid of our desires, then we are in heaven. Probably theologically that's roughly correct, but I think it doesn't work for the life we have to live here on earth, where we need desires in order to keep going and do important things. So I really like Spivak's definition of education, where she says education is not a suppression of desires, but she calls it the non-coercive rearrangement of desires. And that, in a sense, is sort of mapping out quite nicely the terrain that I try to add to talk about in education beyond learning and sense-making and intelligent adaptation. I have some doubts about the non-coercive. At least I would highlight that education here is really difficult, but that is the very difficulty that we need to keep our students close to. And we do that in order to find the desires that can help us individually and collectively to be in the world in what I call in my latest book a grown-up way of being. And then you can say, why might that be important? Is that just Gert Biesta who's arguing that? There is a very nice book. I really enjoyed reading it. It came out a couple of years ago, Paul Roberts, called The Impulse Society. And the subtitle of the book is What's Wrong with Getting What We Want? I recently found out this is the English edition. In the American edition, it's called The United States, what is it, captured by the logic of instant gratification or something like that. So it's even more explicit. What he does in the book is showing in all the different domains of human life in contemporary society what is wrong if we just organize them on the principle that everyone should try to get everything they desire. He shows how the economy gets stuck into that, and we all know the economy makes a lot of money by constantly giving us more desires. He shows how it creates problems in democracy if we just organize our political life in terms of everyone trying to desire, for example, their pure identity. And he also shows how a society that only works on the logic of fulfilling as many desires as possible, but never asking this question, is what we desire what we should be desiring, how it destroys the planet. The only chapter missing in the book is the chapter on education, where I would argue that a lot of what's happening in education is actually also more and more running on the desire principle, particularly in higher education. So there's something also really bad about British higher education, like the student satisfaction survey. That sort of sounds like, have we given you what you desire, rather than have we helped you to interrogate and intelligently rearrange your desires? That, I think, is the educational question. And just talking about satisfaction sort of misses that. So I think what I'm trying to hint at here, a different way of trying to be in the world than the logic of learning, intelligent adaptation, comprehension, understanding, has some important reasons to be there. Now that brings me to a final, very brief comment about a hugely complicated topic, of course. What does this mean for emancipation? Because I started referring to Carl Rogers, who argues learning is the way to emancipation. What I've been trying to argue is learning may have sort of ended up in a position where it's actually getting in the way of emancipation, of living meaningful, humane lives together. So, if we think that emancipation is a question of liberation from power, then learning and knowledge play important roles there. And there you can see sort of the critical project of emancipation, the idea of speaking truth to power. There are two modes of that in the history of emancipation. There is the monological mode, where sort of traditional Marxism, but also I think critical pedagogy got quite a lot of criticism for that, where they say, I've got the truth, I'll give it to you, and you will be emancipated. We know that if you put it like that, it doesn't work. What remains important about the work of Freire is that he has understood that emancipation has to be a dialogical process. And Bloomsbury is publishing the 25th year anniversary edition of Pedagogy of the Oppressed next year, and they're very proud of it, and rightly so, I think. So there is a connection between learning and emancipation, but if learning is becoming part of the problem, then you can begin to ask, do we need to explore different avenues for emancipation, particularly if learning actually becomes a technology or an internalized governmentality that keeps us away from being free. Here I still find Michel Foucault's take on the question of emancipation interesting, where he coins the word evangelization, and this is sort of what he suggests there, that he criticizes the idea that with more knowledge we will be able to push back power. And he says there is a problem there. We must abandon the whole tradition that allows us to imagine that knowledge can only exist where power relations are suspended. And you would argue power and knowledge are always together. That's part of the excitement and part of the problem. And when he begins to talk about are there different ways, different avenues for emancipation, he comes up with this definition of eventualization, which in a sense means to make something into an event, to locate it in space and time, so history is also really important there. He says that's about making visible a singularity, something that is singular rather than universal, at places where there is a temptation to invoke a historical constant, where we say, oh, this has always been the case, nothing new. An immediate anthropological trait, where we say, this is simply how we are as human beings. Or an obviousness which imposes itself uniformly on all. And if you can follow this beautiful translation of probably an even more beautiful French sentence, what I've been trying to do in this talk is to look at learning precisely in this way, to say all the policies that says learning is everywhere, it's uniform and it's for all of us. I've been trying to challenge that. The theorists that say the human being is a learning animal, anthropological trait, or the historical idea that learning has always been there and will always be there. And by just trying to situate learning, I think that can help us to come into a relationship with learning rather than that it sort of comes over us. That is what I see as what in the title of my talk I call this interruption of the politics of learning, which is very practical. So we can talk about it, and from time to time we should do that, but it becomes more interesting to see, can we do it in our classrooms? What does that look like? Showing that you can have meaningful education if learning is out of the classroom. In order to show, for example, that learning is not inevitable, that it's possible not to be a lifelong learner, and that even this desire that we find in ourselves, and we are hardly ever the author of our desires, we encounter them and then we need to figure out where did they come from, that desire to learn, that we can get a perspective on that as well. So that it becomes possible to position ourselves differently in the world. And maybe, and here I am also just an old-fashioned Catholic educator who wants to say, let's go for this, that we ought to position ourselves differently, at least to see that the learning identity in many ways conceptualized that I've tried to discuss, is not the only way to be there. And this raises interesting questions about what is the role of interruption in our lives. Can we interrupt ourselves? What does it mean to let ourselves be interrupted? I think it has something to do with carrying questions with us. This question is the desire that I find in myself, is that what I should be desiring? Or when you encounter something, not immediately to ask, what does it mean? How can I understand it? But to ask, what is this actually asking from me? What is it trying to say to me? And I would say to introduce these questions into the lives of other human beings is part of where this beautiful and risky work of education still plays an important role. So that's what I had prepared. I've tried to indicate that although there is probably a lot that is fantastic about learning, that there may also be problems, and I've tried to show where and how learning may have become a problem, so that at least we are no longer naive about learning, but that's, I realized, an assumption. I assume many of you are not naive about learning. But there are other people outside of this room who are naive about learning. Partly, I think there is a need to interrupt and resist the politics of learning, so constantly being mindful that with this happy word learning, a lot of political stuff comes into the room as well, like this blanket demand to learn, the naturalization of learning, or education without learning. And I've gone into some bigger questions about human existence, you can say, the ontology of learning. What does it actually mean to see ourselves just as meaning-making individuals or organisms, you could say. The whole question of interruption comes into play there. I've alluded that the desired and desirable may have something to do with trying to be in a grown-up way in the world. And that may be important, particularly in a society that pushes us constantly in the opposite direction, that constantly says, through advertising, for example, just desire more and don't question your desires. And I think that is undermining not just the sustainability of our planet, but it's also undermining democracy. Out of that, a huge philosophical claim emerges, where I think that we as human beings are not only animals who can learn, and I think the whole sort of imaginary of intelligent adaptation puts us very much there. Maybe what is peculiar about us as human beings is that we are beings who can be addressed, who can be taught, who can receive a teaching. And I personally find it beautiful to ponder this, to see that the whole question of teaching actually connects to the specific ways in which as human beings we can be in the world together. So I'm not trying to do away with learning. If you want to give that back to me, that's not exactly what I'm trying to say, but more mindful, more descriptive about what we actually do, more historical in our thinking, always to ask where have we come from so that we know where we might go. And that means also to look for alternatives in education beyond learning. And there I think education becomes something else that is really important as well. So thank you very much for your attention, and I can't resist. I hope you didn't learn anything.